Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video we're going to be continuing the read-along of the Secret Zoo, Riddles, and Danger by Brian Schick. So the last time we finished off, we completed chapter 11, so we'll be starting with chapter 12 today. And as always, I'll be showing you any pictures that we do and may come across, but let's go ahead and jump into it. Chapter 12, Damage in the Python Pit. Right here, Tank said, tapping his fingertip on an impression in the ground. Tank was crouched low, his knees bulging out like boulders. The scouts were crowded around him, Richie peering over his shoulder and leaning against his mountainous frame. It was Wednesday, just 2 days after Noah's unnerving conversation with Sam in the tree fort, and the scouts were cross-training with Tank and the Grottoes again. See the toes? Tank swept his finger over 5 adjacent holes. He then traced his finger along a long arch in the imprint. Sasquatch track, and it's fresh. You sure? Richie asked. The big man nodded, then lifted his head to stare down a dimly lit tunnel with brick walls and a dirt floor. A few other footprints were visible. They continued straight, then rounded a bend near a dusty velvet curtain. Tank stood, his bald head nearly touching the ceiling, and he began to take slow, cautious steps down the passage, his arm waving behind for the scouts to follow. Okay, Richie said in a hushed voice. I think this is the part where I have a heart attack. Ella whispered, I'm with Richie this time. In front of his friends, Noah followed Tank, occasionally craning his neck to peer around the big man's body. When Noah's foot dropped down a few inches, he lowered his gaze to see what he'd stepped into, another Sasquatch track. This impression was large enough to set a watermelon in two. He swallowed back his fear and continued on, his heart hammering in his chest. As the 5 of them rounded the bend, he noticed the engraving over the curtain. Platypus Playground. The tracks didn't go that way. The crossers continued another 20 feet down the dim passage and then stopped where the Sasquatch had a gateway marked the Python Pit. Everyone knew the Python Pit was part of the greater exhibit called Snakes a Lot, which was completely independent from Creepy Critters, another building that housed snakes. The Python Pit was a large in-ground exhibit full of trees and streams, and visitors stared into it from above. The Sasquatch prints went beneath the curtain, then came back out. It went in and turned back, Megan said. Why? Tank shook his head. Don't know, but let's check it out. Who wants to go? Ella said, I nominate you. And I nominate the smallest one of us, Tank said. People tend to notice me, even when I'm not walking around in zoo exhibits. Then it's gotta be Richie, Ella said. He's built like a wafer. All he needs to do is stand it sideways to disguise himself as a reed. Noah, Tank said. Go with him. Just stay back and keep your head up. When you cross into the Python Pit, it'll be into a cave in a fake mountainside in the middle of the exhibit. If anyone's around, just keep back to the cave. When Noah and Richie hesitated, Tank said, Come on, you gotta learn to do this stuff if you want to be crossers. Noah thought of the descenders and the way they dismissed him and his friends as weak. Tank was right. If the scouts were going to make it as crossers, they were going to need to do far more dangerous things than this. Without another thought, he grabbed Richie's arm, said, Come on, and stepped into the gateway. As the curtain dropped down their backs, Noah and Richie peered into the cave, just as Tank said they would. A slant of light fell through the mouth of the short cave and partially lit the floor and walls. Noah and Richie stepped aside to avoid the light and pressed their backs against the wall. With Noah in the lead, they slid down the wall and stopped at the opening. Noah held his finger against the tip of his nose, an instruction for Richie to stay quiet. They listened. In the deep confines of the Python Pit, the splash of waterfalls were practically deafening, but there were no other sounds. Noah slowly poked his head forward to stare out. About 50 feet away was the wall of the in-ground exhibit. It rose about 20 feet and then stopped at a railing on the tiled floor of Snakes a Lot. The wall ran in both directions and curved back behind the mountainside to complete a full circle. The Python Pit was crowded with small trees, small shrubs, and leafy vegetation. Vines fell from the heights. An even near-still stream eased along the grassy ground, its push provided by a distant waterfall. The moist air was fragrant with a backwoods smell. Noah peered in both directions. He listened. No visitors seemed to be around. Just as he turned back to say something to his friend, the head of a python appeared by his feet. The snake slithered in the cave, revealing a bright green body flecked with white spots. It neared Richie, circled his ankle, then coiled up his leg, its tongue flicking in and out. Richie clenched his jaws shut and nervously showed his teeth. When the python reached Richie's waist, it reversed direction, eased back to the ground, then slithered out of the cave. "Oh, real nice," Richie said in a quivering voice. "Tell me, does the Grottoes have a portal to the bathroom? I think I peed my pants." "Follow it," Noah said, his finger aimed at the python. "It wants us to show us something." "Why don't you follow it?" Don't think," Noah yelled in a whisper. "Just do." This jolted Richie into action. The skinny scout slipped past Noah and eased out of the cave, but not before uttering a few mild curses at no one in particular. Noah peered out from the cave and watched Richie follow the python as it squirmed surprisingly fast through the tall grass and underbrush. With long strides, his friend tiptoed from one point to the next, the reflective material in his running shoes flashing in the overhead light. As his shoulders rocked, his hat's bushy pom-pom rolled in circles. From the main floor of Snake's lot came a sound, the creaking groan of a swinging door. Then, through the noise of the waterfall, Noah could faintly make out footsteps. Someone was approaching. Noah watched as Richie, who had apparently heard the noise as well, splashed across the narrow stream. The python coiled up its long body and became perfectly still. When Richie was 10 feet from the perimeter wall, he ducked a low tree branch, and a twig snagged his pom-pom and stripped off his hat. Voices erupted from above, and Richie, unable to reach back for his hat, turned and threw his back against the wall just as 3 kids appeared as the rail directly above him. In the shadows of the cave, Noah stared out with one eye. The children were laughing and pointing at different parts of the exhibit. One of them saw the green python and, with a wagging fingertip, revealed it to his friends. Some 20 feet beneath the children, Richie waited, his eyes wide with fear. His arms stretched out and his palms pressed against the wall. 10 feet away from him, his hat dangled. Big and bright, it was out of place as a red tulip in a green pasture. It only took a few seconds for the children to notice it. "Look!" one of the kids said, his voice rising above the sounds of the waterfall. "Some dork dropped his hat." The kids laughed and pointed and clapped their hands. After a few seconds, they stared into the reaches of the exhibit, found nothing of interest, and darted off, their excited voices echoing off the hard walls of Snake's lot. The door squealed open and clattered shut again. Noah waited a few seconds and poked his head out to see that Richie hadn't moved. With his back pressed to the wall and his face ripe with fear, he looked like someone standing on the edge of a tall building. His hair, free from his hat, stood up in swirls and messy clumps. Noah waved his hand toward himself, a gesture that it was safe to continue, and Richie pushed off the wall, grabbed back his hat, and chased after the python, which had uncoiled itself and headed out again. Within seconds, Richie was led around the far side of the fake mountainside, and he disappeared from Noah's view. As Noah waited, he looked around for signs that the Sasquatch had been there. He saw places where the grass had been flattened, presumably by a large foot. Broken twigs dangled by unbroken bark, and some shrubs were partly crushed. He spotted something yellow stretched across the branches of a bush and realized it was a python. By the way its head drooped down, Noah was certain it was dead. Had it attacked the Sasquatch only to be killed and flung into the bush? Noah moved his gaze and saw the still tail poking out from the distant end of the stream. Had the Sasquatch murdered this snake too? Squashed it with its big feet and then kicked it aside? Noah spotted movement from the corners of his eye and turned to look. Richie was charging back toward the cave, his eyes wide, his arms swinging wildly at his sides. He bounded a bush and then brushed past Noah into the cover of the cave. Noah swung around, saying, "What is it?" Richie straightened his glasses, which had slid down the tip of his nose to be fogged up with his excited breaths. "On the other side, there's a place where the railing," he pointed to the railing along the pit, "is bent real bad. The python showed me by climbing along a branch." "So, maybe some fatso stood on it or something." Richie shook his head. "The wall is damaged right below the railing. It's cracked, and a few places are punched out, and there are tufts of hair lining the grass. The Sasquatch, it grabbed the railing and scaled the wall, but it didn't escape. I saw its tracks on the ground of Python Pit." Noah moved his stare to a dark spot of the cave to explore his thoughts. It could have escaped, and didn't. Why not? The same reason the Sasquatch beneath the Knick-Knack and Snack Shack didn't. It's scouting the grounds, preparing for something. Noah turned back to Richie and again saw his nervousness. "Come on," Noah said. "Let's go tell Tank." Richie nodded, and the two of them rushed to the end of the short cave and pushed through the curtain back into the grottoes, Noah wondering how their news would change things. Chapter 13. Wide Walt in the Monster Dome. The next day, the scouts forced themselves to go into school and tried their best to feign interest in their classwork. But being part of a secret civilization responsible for the safety of the world was growing to be quite a distraction. It was hard to solve for X and memorize state capitals when you knew monsters were prowling around in underground tunnels, threatening your neighborhood. At lunch, the friends ate at a private spot on a cafeteria bench and quietly discussed the grottos and the things that they had seen there. Around them, students drank their chocolate milk, ignored their vegetables, and shouted at their friends. Spills occurred every few minutes, and crumbs flew like shrapnel from grenades. After eating, the four of them headed outside for recess and hunted down another place to talk. They settled on the vacant space beneath the large dome climber toward the rear of the playground. More than 8 feet tall, the old steel climber was affectionately called the Monster Dome. It lacked the appeal of modern play structures, which sprawled in all directions, connecting slides and bridges and platforms. The Monster Dome frequently went unused, except by upper L students to hide out from second graders. Just a few minutes into their conversation, 3 kids approached. Wide Walter White and his 2 cronies, Dave and Doug. As they neared, their big angry feet kicked through the wood chips, stirring dust. "Oh, great," Richie said. "This doesn't look good." Noah glanced around. As usual, there wasn't a playground attendant in sight. The scouts were alone, and Walt was undoubtedly aware of this. For him, bullying was a science. The scouts hadn't confronted Wide Walt since their most recent altercation with the broad-shouldered thug. Just weeks ago, Noah had shocked Clarksville Elementary by tripping Walt in the cafeteria, nearly dropping him to the ground. "Well, well," Walt growled as he approached. "The action dorks. All together and all alone." Walt and his friends slipped through the separate openings in the bars and stood just beneath the curved peak of the dome. The scouts jumped to their feet and nervously faced the schoolyard bullies. As Noah took a step forward, Megan lightly coiled her fingers around his waist, holding him back. Walt smiled at this. He crossed his arms over his chest, resting his forearms on the bulge of his gut. His shoulders were so wide that his head seemed puny in comparison. "Little sis going to fight your battles now?" Walt's buddies erupted in exaggerated laughter. The chill air carried the fog of their breath, a stench of corn chips and cheddar cheese. Walt grumbled, "We got some unfinished business, dork." Noah shook his head. "I don't have any business," he said. "Not with you." He discreetly scanned the playground in search of an adult. Behind Walt, a few kids had noticed the unfolding scene and were now busily alerting their friends, who began leaping off rock walls and throwing themselves from swings. Within a minute, they'd have the Monster Dome surrounded. "I think you do," Walt said, and he reached up with one arm and shoved Noah hard. Streaks of pain shot across Noah's chest and curled over his shoulders. He struggled for balance and stood his ground. Kids were already crowding the scene. Some were hollering. A young girl started to cry and ran off. Inside the open space of the dome, Noah suddenly felt like a fighter before a crowd of spectators, a weary gladiator in the pit of the Colosseum. "Keep cool," Megan said. Noah refused to turn his gaze from Walt. "Why do you want to do this? You ever stop to think that you create a lot of problems for yourself?" "Oh, I create a lot of problems," Walt agreed, "but not for me. For other people." He held his open palms out to his sides in a "what do you think about that" fashion, and glanced over at his buddies, a smug look on his face. "Whoever said I'm not a generous guy?" Grunting, Dave and Doug nodded their approval. Noah realized how small and insignificant they appeared beside their leader. Without Walt, Dave and Doug would be nothing. Stardust in the galaxy of Clarksville Elementary. "I got something I want to share with you," Walt said. "What?" Noah said before he had time to think better. "This." Walt thrust his arms forward and pushed Noah again, harder than before. This time the pain shot all through his torso. He stumbled backward, toppled, and barely prevented himself from falling. Ella jumped forward and shoved Walt, who barely budged. Walt turned to her and let out a disbelieving chuckle. Ella propped up her hands on her hips and pushed her elbows out to her sides. "Keep laughing, fat boy. I'll kick your—" "White!" a voice rang out. The crowd parted, revealing Mr. Kershen, the toughest sixth-grade teacher in all of Clarksville. He had a broad back, a shaggy mustache, and crooked yellow teeth. In another life, he might have been a Viking. "White!" Mr. Kershen repeated. "You have got to be kidding me." Everyone assumed that Wide Walt was the aggressor in any altercation. Walt spun around and tried to look surprised that something was wrong. "What?" "Don't what me, Walter." Mr. Kershen jerked his thumb toward the school. "To the principal's office. Now." Wide Walt slouched his gargantuan shoulders and kicked at the wood chips. He squirmed and squeezed his oversized body through a triangular opening in the dome climber and headed toward the school. Mr. Kershen turned to watch the bully go. Then he faced the crowd of students and waved them away, saying, Go do something, for crying out loud." As the children scattered, the scouts climbed out of the dome, Richie breathing a loud sigh of relief. Mr. Kershen stepped up to them. "You guys okay?" All of them at once, the four of them answered yes. The rough-looking teacher looked them over. "That clown's bad news," he said at last. "Try to stay away from him." "We do," Noah said. "All the time." Wrinkles moved across Mr. Kershen's face as he formed a more concerned expression. He nodded, knowing Wide Walt and knowing that Noah had said was true. The scouts turned and headed for a new spot. Once again, they narrowly avoided a beating from the school bully. Noah wondered how long they could continue to be so lucky. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 13. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and we'll be continuing our read-along of The Secret Zoo in the next video, where we continue with chapter 14. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and please take good care of yourselves. Bye.